Welcome to the deep dive. We take sources you, our listener, provide, and we explore them, really dig in to extract the key information and insights. Think of it as your shortcut to understanding some, well, often fascinating and overlooked perspectives.
And today, yeah, we're venturing into a truly unique area. A listener shared a transcript from a YouTube video, makes some very unusual claims about Pope Francis. So we're going to delve into what it actually says.
That's right. The video is titled 1026 FR NC 280 Amisol P2 degrees. Pate François est mort operatrice externe Marie Rosa Mavilla Methode Grifasi. It's from the channel FR Colagro Grifasi Investigations Français. I mean, the title itself kind of hints at the unconventional journey we're about to take.
Definitely. And our goal here, just to be clear, isn't to confirm or, deny any of these claims. It's really more about understanding the viewpoint presented in the transcript and exploring its implications. We're essentially offering you, the listener, a distilled look into this very specific and, frankly, rather extraordinary perspective.
Okay,
Let's unpack this.
Right. So the transcript kicks off with a remote viewing session. This was focused on Pope Francis, apparently on April 28th. What did the viewer perceive initially?
Well, the first impression is quite vivid, actually. The viewer describes seeing Pope Francis seated in a wheelchair, but he's in this completely black sort of empty space.
Black Andy.
Yeah, he was seen in profile, seemed unaware he was being observed, and the feeling reported was that he was profoundly lost. It's a pretty stark image to start with.
Lost in an empty black space.
Yeah, that definitely sets a tone. And according to this remote viewing, what about his DNA?
Ah, yes. This is where the claims get particularly, let's say, striking. The analysis mentioned in the transcript allegedly revealed his DNA to be 95% human.
Okay, 95.
But the remaining 5% identified as reptilian.
Reptilian.
And apparently no other non-human DNA was detected. It's, interesting how these narratives often bring in these non-human or other elements.
It might tap into certain anxieties, maybe about the unknown or like a hidden control themes you sometimes see in these kinds of beliefs.
Reptilian DNA. Okay, let's just keep going. So the transcript then looks at his state after death, or the purported state after death. What were his expectations versus the reality perceived by the remote viewer?
Right. So reportedly, Pope Francis himself was expecting, the traditional afterlife scene, light angels, maybe a welcoming embrace, that sort of thing.
A classic image.
Exactly. But instead, the remote viewer perceived him still within that same dark, kind of smoky illusion, still feeling lost, confused, apparently wondering why his expectations weren't being met.
A smoky illusion. Okay.
Yeah.
And what purpose does the transcript suggest for this smokescreen?
Well, the explanation given is that this smokescreen is itself an illusion. It's meant to make him feel isolated, lost in this perceived darkness. If the goal is isolation, you might wonder what purpose that would serve for these other entities mentioned, according to the source, anyway.
Okay. Now, the transcript brings up the question of Pope Francis's actual death date. It asks, was it Monday, April 21st, 2025? Which seems like a plausible timeline if an announcement happened then.
But the remote viewer's perception was a firm no. The transcript states he did not die on that date.
Not the 21st, so when?
The perceived date of death was actually 8 days prior to that.
8 days earlier, so around April 13th then. Huh. And the transcript mentions this word masquerade, like a staged event surrounding the announcement of his death on the 21st, which significantly was Resurrection Day.
Exactly.
What's the supposed significance of staging it like that?
Well, according to the source, the significance is pretty substantial. Announcing his death specifically on Resurrection Day is suggested to be a deliberately pre-planned event. The aim, to create this atmosphere of really intense fervor and also anxiety among the faithful.
For anxiety.
Yeah. The idea presented is that this carefully chosen timing was meant to deeply influence their beliefs, kind of leverage the religious significance of the day. And this idea of manipulation of orchestrated events, that kind of ties into how the transcript then interprets the prophecies we're going to talk about.
Right, so the timing wasn't just coincidence, it was a deliberate act. What's this sort of hidden meaning the transcript attributes to announcing it on Resurrection Day specifically?
It elaborates on that. The intention, it suggests, was precisely to instill a sense of, destiny and to really powerfully reinforce faith. It's framed as a kind of strategic move, maybe to counteract what's perceived as a, global decline in religious beliefs.
So using a major event involving a beloved figure, timed perfectly to kind of compel belief in the unseen. That's fascinating. Okay, the deep dive then shifts gears a bit, turns to the well-known prophecy of the last pope. How does this transcript interpret that?
Well, the traditional prophecy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The last pope presides over great trouble, leads to the fall of Rome, the end of the
Oh,
papacy.
great, the dramatic one.
Yeah. But the remote viewer's interpretation here is different.
Yeah.
It suggested that this prophecy is actually designed primarily to instill fear.
Fear as a means of control.
That seems to be the implication. Fear as a tool.
And is there a specific vision associated with this interpretation in the transcript?
Yes, there is. The vision described is of a man dressed not in white, but in black, with rose-colored elements,
Oh.
like a sash or trim.
Black and rose, not white. Okay.
And this figure is seen amidst scenes of war, explosions, but he seems sort of placed there, interacting with government leaders, presidents, politicians, that sort of thing.
And who is this man? Is it supposed to be the last pope?
No, according to the remote viewing in the transcript, this individual is identified specifically as a cardinal, not Pope Francis.
A cardinal in black and rose amidst chaos, talking to world leaders.
Interesting. Okay, so if it's not the literal end, how does the transcript interpret the whole fall of Rome and the end of the papacy part?
Yeah, the interpretation offered isn't a literal destruction or end. It's more like a renewal, or maybe a transformation of the religion itself.
A renewal. The idea seems to be that the religion will adapt, change to fit societal shifts, but it will maintain the manipulation and maybe the false appearances, just in a new, more contemporary way.
So a change in how it operates, not an actual extinction.
That's the gist of it, yeah. A
Yeah.
change in form.
That's a really notable spin on that prophecy. Okay. The transcript also touches on the Latin text at the end of the prophecy of Malachi, the part about Petrus Romanus, the destruction of the city on 7 hills, the last judgment. What does the remote viewer say about that?
Right, that part. The vision associated with this text is described as an old man with a beard, writing. But crucially, he's not alone.
Not alone.
He's perceived as being interfered with somehow as he's writing.
Interfered with, like someone influencing him.
That's the impression given. And this prophecy, too, is linked back to that theme of religious renewal, stemming from this perceived disconnect between, the current form of the religion and what society needs or wants now.
Okay, interference during the writing. That's a compelling detail. And the purpose attributed to this prophecy, is it also about fear?
Seems so. Similar to the other one, the perceived intention isn't presented as predicting a genuine apocalypse or, literal destruction. It's seen more as another tool to generate fear, another way to manipulate the faithful through these really dramatic pronouncements.
Okay. And the transcript mentions that the man in black and this bearded writer, they reappear at certain points.
Yes, exactly. The man in black with the rose sash, the cardinal figure, he apparently reappeared in the remote viewing when the Petrus Romanus prophecy was being discussed.
Right.
And interestingly, the old bearded man, the writer, he specifically appeared when the name Malachi was mentioned. And that's when the perception was strongest that he was being actively influenced, interfered with by another being while writing, as if someone was whispering what to put down.
Wow. So the visions seem very specifically tied to the parts of the prophecies being discussed. Okay, let's shift focus. The deep dive then looks at the geopolitical situation after Pope Francis's passing. What does the remote viewer see happening globally?
The viewing depicts a global scene, looking at Earth with numerous explosions all over.
Explosions, like literal bombs.
Both, apparently.
Yeah.
Interpreted as literal acts of conflict, yes, but also metaphorical upheavals. Things like radical decisions being made driven by anger and fear, not, rational thought.
And which areas are highlighted? Where is this happening?
Europe and the USA are mentioned prominently. Africa, too, though maybe to a lesser extent. And China.
Okay.
But there's also specific, very strong opposition noted between the Ukrainian president and Donald Trump, perceived as happening after the Pope's death. And this conflict is seen almost as a direct consequence of the widespread fear generated by the whole event.
A major geopolitical clash potentially triggered by this, according to this source. Wow. Okay. The discussion then moves into more esoteric territory, focusing on the upcoming conclave to elect the next pope. What's the perceived atmosphere around that?
Yeah, the terms used in the transcript are pretty evocative. One is débandade, which suggests, disarray, chaos, maybe even a rout.
Débandade.
And the other is la curée, which
Sure.
translates roughly to the spoils or like a feeding frenzy.
Not exactly calm deliberation, then.
Not at all. The remote viewer describes a chaotic scene, many robed figures, presumably cardinals, actually physically arguing, shoving maybe, physical altercations.
Physical fights, seriously, that's vivid. And what's happening on the esoteric level during all this chaos?
Well, esoterically, it's described as a whole variety of different beings being present. And they're not just observing, they're seen as sort of enjoying it, even actively fueling the chaos.
Fueling it. Why?
Their motivations are described simply as serving their own interests, primarily by harvesting energy from the situation, feeding off the conflict.
Different beings harvesting energy. Does it say what kind of energy?
It makes a distinction, actually. According to the transcript, reptilian beings are perceived as primarily seeking prayer energy,
Okay.
whereas humanoid beings, who are apparently assisted by some kind of energetic grids, are more focused on establishing dominance, using the situation to gain control.
So different agendas, different energy appetites in this unseen realm. What about the candidates themselves? The potential popes?
Right. The initial number of perceived candidates was 8. That apparently gets narrowed down to 4.
Okay, 4 frontrunners.
But even among those 4, the transcript says significant disagreement persists. It's not easily resolved. And these esoteric tensions, this conflict between entities, are believed to directly manifest as, well, physical tensions among the cardinals.
Like the arguments mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And also as geopolitical tensions between nations, countries vying for influence based on who gets elected.
Geopolitical stakes tied directly to the papal election. Which countries does the transcript see as most invested?
Italy and America are highlighted as having a big stake. Also Romania, France, though maybe a bit less so, Spain, and Portugal. They're all seen as kind of competing for the prestige and, the power that comes with having their guy elected, so to speak.
So it's portrayed as this really high-stakes game operating on both the esoteric and the geopolitical levels.
Okay.
The deep dive then zooms in on the death announcement itself, April 21st. What was the perceived esoteric impact of that announcement on the global population?
Yeah, the announcement is said to have triggered this really powerful surge of energy emanating from people all over the world.
What kind of energy?
It's described as a mix. Fear, definitely. Anger, too. Anger at the event itself, maybe the timing. And also this deep fear of being, like, alone or abandoned, left without a spiritual leader.
And did this collective energy have a characteristic color, maybe?
Yes. The perceived color was gray.
Gray energy. Interesting. And where did all this energy reportedly go?
It's said to have been drawn into the earth. And there it formed this large egregore.
Egregore. What's it?
Well, in esoteric thought, an egregore is often described as like a psychic entity or a collective energy form created by the shared thoughts and emotions of a group.
Okay.
So in this context, it's described as a huge energy field specifically connected to the Catholic religion, filled with all those prayers, demands, but also guilt, and especially that fear we mentioned.
An energetic reservoir of all that religious emotion, both positive and negative, it sounds like. Who benefits from this egregore, according to the transcript?
The transcript suggests it acts basically as a readily available reservoir, a pool of energy that various beings can tap into and draw from.
To feed on?
Essentially, yeah. It's perceived as not being conscious itself, the egregore, but more like a source of sustenance for these other entities.
A feeding ground built from collective human emotion in the unseen realm. Wow. Okay, then the focus shifts to the funeral itself. What was perceived inside the basilica during the ceremony?
Inside the basilica, the description is that many of the attendees, the humans, were reportedly accompanied by their own interfering entities.
Each person potentially having entities with them.
That's the picture painted. And the types of entities listed are, again, reptilians, humanoids, but also insectoids, greys, and even discarnate beings like spirits who haven't moved on. Allegedly, these non-physical beings actually outnumbered the physical attendees inside.
Outnumbered. That's an overwhelming unseen presence. What was the energy, the feeling like inside the basilica then?
It was described as very heavy, oppressive even, not the luminous or sacred quality you might expect at a major religious event like a papal funeral.
Heavy and oppressive. And the purpose of all these entities being there?
According to the transcript, their purpose wasn't reverence or honoring the deceased. It was perceived as them just waiting to feed on the energy coming off the attendees.
Feeding on what specifically?
Feelings like fear again, but also greed and cupidity, intense desire, or avarice.
So not a gathering of reverence, but almost an energetic buffet from this viewpoint. What about outside, St. Peter's Square, where huge crowds gather for these things?
Yeah, outside, same picture, just on a larger scale.
Yeah.
A massive crowd, and again, numerous interfering entities present among them.
And the energy.
And mix. That same gray energy was seen emanating from the masses, feeding back into that big egregore we talked about.
Right.
But also just raw distress, sadness, fervent prayer energy, all of it being harvested, apparently.
So the emotional outpouring of the entire event, inside and out, is framed as a resource for these various entities. Okay. The deep dive then circles back to the prophecy and that idea of a renewal of religion, not an end. What's the perceived motivation behind this renewal? Why change things?
Well, the motivation presented is pretty pragmatic, actually. It's about attracting a younger and ultimately larger demographic of believers.
Why?
Because the perception is that the current base of followers is, aging and shrinking. They need new recruits, essentially.
Okay, makes sense from a strategic standpoint.
Yeah.
And what methods does the transcript envision them using to achieve this renewal? How do they plan to attract younger people?
The primary methods highlighted are, maybe unsurprisingly, social media and artificial intelligence.
AI. How would AI be used?
The transcript describes a pretty specific scenario. It involves an AI-generated apparition, like a hologram or deepfake, of the Virgin Mary appearing at some kind of festival.
An AI Virgin Mary.
Yeah, which then rapidly spreads through social media, popping up on phones, televisions, reaching millions instantly.
Wow. So the idea isn't just like the church getting a TikTok account. It's suggesting something much more advanced, creating really believable digital religious experiences.
Exactly. Almost like a virtual reality encounter, designed to be deeply persuasive and sway people's beliefs.
Okay, a technologically driven religious experience. What's the predicted impact of something like that on, say, non-believers or people who've maybe drifted away from the faith?
The transcript suggests it would cause a pretty divided reaction.
How so?
Some people will apparently see it for what it is or what the source claims it is. Manipulation, maybe find it ridiculous.
Right.
But others, maybe people who are already searching for faith or feeling lost, they might experience doubt, shock, and it could potentially draw them back in or pull them in for the first time. The theory presented involves the subconscious, that the free parts will recognize the trick, but other parts, maybe those already interfered with, could be more easily influenced.
So it could actually deepen the divide between believers and skeptics. Are there other methods mentioned for attracting people besides AI miracles?
Yeah, a couple of other things. It mentions a move towards a seemingly more open discourse, specifically notes the LGBT rainbow flag as an example of appearing more inclusive.
Okay.
And also just generally using modern tools, apps, social media, etc., but in a deliberately light, maybe even entertaining way to spread their message. Kind of meeting people where they are.
Modernizing the outreach. And how effective does the transcript predict these methods will ultimately be?
The prediction is actually somewhat muted. It suggests that while these strategies will attract some people, they won't achieve the kind of, total widespread fervor and blind faith that might be the ultimate goal. Many people are expected to remain kind of distant, skeptical, or just disengaged.
So only limited success in generating that mass religious zeal they might be hoping for. Okay. The deep dive then revisits the author of that prophecy of Malachi, the old bearded man writing. Are there any more insights provided about him?
Yes, that vision is revisited. The transcript clarifies the perception. This man was believed to be incarnated, a real person, but he was being actively interfered with during the writing process. The interfering entity was essentially whispering the content of the prophecy to him, dictating it.
And did it identify who or what this interfering entity was?
Yes. It's identified as a dragon.
A dragon, dictating the Malachi prophecy. That is quite an image.
It is. Very striking.
What were the dragon's supposed motivations for doing this? Why interfere?
According to the transcript, the motivations were sort of twofold. First, simply to harvest energy from the man himself.
Yeah.
His emotions, his focus.
Okay.
And second, purely for its own amusement. To manipulate him into writing this prophecy that would influence humanity for centuries, essentially. Mocking human gullibility, perhaps.
Wow. So a deeply cynical manipulation just for energy and cosmic entertainment by this dragon entity. What about the man himself? What was his emotional state while writing this dictated prophecy?
Interestingly, it wasn't described as fear. It was more like anxiety, stemming from his genuine belief that he was divinely connected, that the prophecy was real and important.
So he believed it was authentic.
Yes. And reportedly, he also felt ego and pride related to being the recipient of this divine knowledge, all of which the anxiety, the belief, the ego, the pride, were apparently being energetically harvested by the dragon.
A complex mix of genuine seeking and personal ego all being exploited. Does it share any details about the man's life? What kind of person was he?
He's described as uh, contemplative, thoughtful, a solitary kind of individual. Somebody who spent a lot of time meditating, taking long, reflective walks, not explicitly religious in a formal church sense, apparently, but definitely someone actively seeking a deeper connection, a deeper understanding of things.
A seeker, essentially, who was unknowingly manipulated into creating this hugely significant religious text, if you follow this transcript's narrative.
Okay.
The deep dive then offers a few more insights into Pope Francis's passing or the aftermath. What are the continuing perceptions there?
Right. The ongoing perception described is still of Pope Francis within that black fog. He himself believes he's isolated in just a dark room.
Still in the illusion.
Yes. But the viewer perceives this room, or fog, as actually being contained within some kind of vessel. And this vessel is apparently directed by the Ashtar command.
Ashtar command, okay. And he stays there.
He remains in this illusory state, according to the transcript, until the next pope is elected.
So he's in a kind of holding pattern, overseen by Ashtar command. What happens after the new pope is chosen?
Then, reportedly, he will be projected into another illusion. This time it will be the one he originally expected. The light, the angels, luminous beings, the whole welcoming scene.
So he gets what he expected eventually.
He sees what he expected. But the transcript emphasizes that this, too, will still be a constructed illusion, not the genuine article, so to speak.
Still manufactured. And after that?
Following this illusory heaven, he will apparently be placed into future incarnations, but ones that are not of his own choosing or making.
A cycle of manipulated realities and directed rebirths. That's the view presented here.
Wow. The transcript also briefly revisits that potential conflict between the Ukrainian president and Donald Trump. Any more details on that?
It's just that the earlier vision of a really strong conflict is reiterated, with the added information or perception that this conflict is expected to significantly reshape the global landscape. It's seen as a major turning point.
Okay.
And there's also a mention, sort of tacked on, of a perceived potential shift involving Putin as well, tied into these dynamics. Significant global changes potentially spinning out from this post-Pope Francis dynamic. That is, well, that's a truly expansive and quite extraordinary set of claims to consider.
It really is.
Yeah.
This deep dive into this particular YouTube transcript certainly provides a very unique and multifaceted perspective on the papacy, prophecy, geopolitics, and these unseen forces that it claims are at play.
Well, thank you for joining us on this very deep dive into some truly unconventional source material today. We've explored the claimed circumstances around Pope Francis's death, some really unique interpretations of ancient prophecies, the potential geopolitical fallout, and these complex esoteric dynamics surrounding the papacy, all drawn from this one specific video transcript.
Yeah, and it's definitely important to remember this offers one very specific and, yes, quite extraordinary viewpoint. Our aim, as always, was just to understand the claims being presented in the source and explore their potential implications, not necessarily to validate them.
Absolutely. We really encourage you, our listener, to reflect on the information we've discussed today and maybe explore some of these topics further on your own if they pique your interest. So considering this deep dive, maybe a final thought to leave you with. What does this make you think about the nature of belief itself, the structures of power we see, and perhaps the unseen influences that might be shaping our world? That's definitely something to ponder until our next exploration.